What kind of evidence do historians hope for when they're trying to establish what probably happened in the past? Historians want to have contemporary accounts of the events that they narrate. They want these events to be close to the time, they want these accounts to be close to the time of the events themselves. They want to have lots of these accounts, multiple sources if possible. They want these sources to be independent of one another. You don't want sources that had collaborated with one another. You want independent, multiple sources for different accounts. You want these independent, multiple sources to be consistent with one another. If they contradict one another, then you've got a problem, because you don't know which source then to rely upon. Moreover, you want sources that are not biased toward their subject. You want sources that, in fact, are not simply promoting their own beliefs. You want independent sources that are not biased toward their subject, if possible. This is what you want. This is what historians hope for. What do historians have when it comes to the Gospels of the New Testament? Our sources for knowing about the life of Jesus and, if it happened, his resurrection. Do the sources that we have coincide with what we hope for? First thing to point out is the dates of these sources. The Gospels of the New Testament are much later than the accounts that they narrate. Most historians date the first Gospel as the Gospel of Mark and indicate that it was written sometime around the year 65 or 70 AD. In other words, 35 or 40 years after the death of Jesus. And it is our first Gospel. Matthew and Luke were written 10 or 15 years later, maybe 80 to 85. John is written 10 or 15 years after that, maybe 90 to 95. In other words, our Gospels are separated from the life of Jesus anywhere from 35 to 65 years. That's the time gap between the death of Jesus and the first accounts of his life, 35 to 65 years. They are not contemporary accounts. These accounts are not written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the titles in our Bibles, but those titles were added by later editors. Whoever wrote the Gospel according to Matthew didn't call it the Gospel according to Matthew. Somebody else is telling you who they think wrote the Gospel, and those inscriptions aren't found until the 2nd century. They're not original to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing later, and in fact, they're not even speaking the language that Jesus spoke, Aramaic. They write in Greek. They're highly literate, Greek-speaking Christians living decades later. Jesus' own disciples, by the way, were Aramaic speakers who were peasants of the lower class and were illiterate. They did not write the Gospels. Where did the Gospel writers get their stories from if they're writing decades after the fact? They got their stories from oral traditions that were in circulation year after the death of Jesus. Jesus died and people started telling stories about him in order to convert people to the faith. When somebody converted, they told the story to somebody else. That person told the stories to somebody else. That person told the stories to somebody else, and that person told the stories to somebody else. This went on for year after year after year, decade after decade, before the Gospel writers were themselves writing. What happens when stories are put in circulation orally? Stories get changed. If you ever had your children play the game telephone in a birthday party where one kid tells a story to the next kid sitting at the birthday party, and then the story goes to the next kid, goes around the circle until it comes back to the first kid, it's a different story. If it weren't a different story, it'd be a pretty dumb birthday party game to play. The stories change. What happens if you play this game not in one living room with a bunch of kids from the same socioeconomic class who all speak the same language? What if you play the game for 35, 45, 55 years in different languages, in different countries, telling stories that the people who are telling the stories were not there to witness? What happens to the stories? The stories get changed. Do I have evidence that the stories get changed? Yes, indeed. There is very solid evidence, namely that you have different sources telling the same stories, and in almost every instance when different sources tell the same stories, in the New Testament, the stories are different. Sometimes in little ways, sometimes in big ways. Somebody was changing the stories. You can see this for yourself. The reason people don't see this normally is because the way people normally read the Bible. The way you normally read the Bible is you're going to read the Gospels, and so you start reading the Gospel of Matthew. And you start Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The first 16 verses are genealogies, not very interesting. You read them anyway because it's the Bible. And then you go on through, you get down then to chapter 17, and the action starts picking up. And you read Matthew, you go through chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3. You go all the way through chapter 28, you've read Matthew. Then you start reading Mark. You start at the beginning of Mark, you go to the bottom, chapters 1 through 16. Then you read Luke. And Mark, by the way, sounds a lot like Matthew. Then you read Luke, and it sounds a lot like Mark. You read John, it's kind of different, but it sounds pretty much like the others. They're all basically saying the same story. The reason it sounds that way is because you're reading them vertically. The way to notice differences in the Gospels is to read them not vertically, but to read them horizontally. Read a story in Matthew, then read the same story in Mark, and then read the same story in Luke, and compare them in detail. In almost every instance, you will find differences. Let me just give you some examples from the death accounts and resurrection accounts of Jesus. The accounts of Jesus' death. What day did Jesus die on, and what time of day? Did Jesus die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says, John 19, verse 14, or was he executed on the day after the Passover meal was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Which was it? Before or after the meal? Did he die sometime after noon, as John explicitly says? Or did he die at 9, was he crucified at 9 o'clock in the morning, as Mark explicitly says? It depends which account you read. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Did both of the robbers crucified with Jesus mock him, or did only one of them mock him, and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or did it rip in half after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Those are simply examples from Jesus' death. You can do this with any story found commonly throughout the Gospels. In more than one gospel, you will find that, in fact, you have different stories. Now look at the resurrection. Can we trust these sources to give us a reliable account of what happened at the resurrection? Well, look at the stories themselves in the Gospels and ask yourself, are they telling the same story or not? Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary Magdalene alone, or Mary with other women? If it was with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they, and what were their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone rolled away before they got there or not? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see when they got to the tomb? Did they see one man? Did they see two men? Or did they see one angel? It depends which gospel you read. Now, by the way, people try and reconcile all these differences. I mean, for example, with this one here, what the people will say is, well, what they actually saw were two angels. So that one gospel says it was two men because they mistook the angels for men. Another says it was one angel because there was one angel, but there was also another one. And there was also one man because there was an angel who was mistaken for a man, but there was also another one. So the way you solve the problem is you say there were two angels. In other words, you solve the problem by saying something that none of the Gospels say. That's how you reconcile it, by creating your own gospel. What were the women at the tomb told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem, or were they supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus? It depends which gospel author you read. Did the women tell anyone what they saw or not? It depends which gospel you read. All of these differ depending on which gospel you read. Did the disciples leave Jerusalem to go to Galilee, or did they stay in Jerusalem? Did they never leave, or did they leave right away? It depends which gospel you read. These gospels are all different from one another in their details. Are they the kind of sources that historians would rely upon for historical information? I would argue that, in fact, these are not the kinds of sources that can be relied upon by historians.